Realtors of Reddit, what's the most disturbing history you've learned about a house you're selling? My grandma sells rents houses in the Denver area. A few weeks ago I had to help her evict a few college bros from one of her properties. This is a cottage-style home, no second floor, no basement. These guys literally dug a hole in the wood floor and made a basement where they've been throwing trash away for the last year. Like it's a living room. With a TV. And a couple armchairs. And a giant hole in the ground filled with ice cream wrappers, pizza boxes, and cigarette butts. My parents were realtors and also flipped houses. When I was growing up, I used to help them a lot, usually by cleaning. When I was 12, I was helping with a house that was infested with roaches. I noticed the closets were smeared with shit and children's handprints. There were fingernail scratches on the insides of the doors as well. I asked my parents why this was the case. They told me the old tenants used to lock their toddlers in the closets for days. When I was looking for my last house, I went with my wife and realtor to look at several houses. We went to look at one house in particular because it didn't seem like the price they were asking for could be real. Huge house sitting on tons of land with outbuildings. Going for millions under market value. We got there, and the realtor said, "Oh, I should mention, a serial killer lived here, and when he was put away, cops found 11 bodies on the property." Oh, well that'll do it. I photograph homes. It's normal. People die in homes. I photographed a few homes where the reason for sale was a recent suicide in the home. I photographed a new home that the builder killed himself in the garage just before the project was complete. The weirdest one was mostly very creepy and suspicious. I photographed a billionaire's compound where the guy had an absurd fascination with flesh. There were well over 50 heads mounted on walls from water buffalo to elephant. 5 to 10 large cats, stuffed, chandeliers made from the feathers of rare birds, stools made from elephant feet legs. They were hairy, paintings and abstract photos of oily skin, veiny muscles of humans and animals. I looked for his kill room, but I never found it. In general, I find billionaires don't behave like normal people, but this one was particularly weird. In Seattle, there was a house just up the block from my work. This was probably around 2007 or 8 or so. There was a zombie-themed rave, and said house became the after-party. Most of the club kids knew each other, and the ages ranged from 16 to 21. Unfortunately, they invited this loner dude who came over and started unloading a shotgun around 6:37 in the morning. Kids dressed like zombies were pouring out of the houses, jumping over fences, into the street, into the backyard. Nobody knew who was actually wounded and who wasn't because everybody looked due to their costume. I think like 6 to 7 died. It was totally and has always stuck with me. Probably because it was in my neighborhood in which I lived and worked. Eventually the house went up for sale, and I always wondered how much the prospective buyers knew about what happened there. Houses in Seattle don't stay long on the market, so it had a lot of real estate agents and buyers coming and going. I also wondered if there was a little discount considering its history. Not a realtor, happened to some friends who bought a property, very old site, about 300 years old, which had been part of a convent, the living room of the nuns exactly. The aforementioned place had been refurbished as small apartments houses about 50 years ago. They went to live there, and there was some maintenance given to certain places of the property, the common areas. There was a wall which was slightly wider than the others. They began to give maintenance to that wall, but the outer layer fell apart due to the rain and age. While trying to fix that, they found dozens of skeletons of babies. Very little babies and very old little skeletons. Well, authorities and historians came and went by, and they came to the conclusion the nuns tossed their babies there right after giving birth to them. Lord knows if they were alive or dead by then. Note, not unheard of, old religious orders are very strict about that, and there were even more gruesome policies regarding nuns' pregnancies. Edit grammar. Well, not me, but a house that my parents own. My father was speaking with the previous owner about anything he needs to know about the house. The previous owner starts mentioning the man who lived in the house as a tenant was brutally shot and only made it to the backyard before he died from loss of blood. This house is located in a very bad area of our city, so shootings are not at all uncommon. Fast forward a few years and we find out that one of the people living in our house was selling drugs. The drug dealer is eventually arrested in that house, leaving his wife, mother-in-law, and daughter in the house. A few years more and we need to kick out our tenants because they hadn't paid rent for months. A few nights after my parents went to go tell the tenants to leave or else they were going to get kicked out, the house burst into flames. A very large portion of the house was in ruins. All the kitchen, one of the rooms, and most of the living room burnt to a crisp. Luckily, the insurance covered the damage. Thankfully, the house has been sold. Last thing that I heard about it is our now ex-tenant, a new one, was not paying rent and got into a very nasty fist fight with the people in the neighborhood. He got into the house completely covered in blood and bruises. They had to call the ambulance to save the guy, too. A small word of advice, people. If you're going to buy a house, always take location into account. Sometimes buying a house in a dangerous neighborhood for a cheaper price can prove to be a big mistake. I have been witness to a few and heard of some others. The first one involves a couple who bought a house in the 1980s. They called me a couple years ago wanting to sell. As we're talking, the wife starts telling me about her difficult pregnancies and how she'd been pregnant many times but lost them all. I feel bad for her, but I'm wondering what this has to do with anything. The husband pipes up and says, "After the last one, I didn't know what to do. I came home and the first thing I thought to do was remodel the kitchen. I had to break something." He goes on about his impromptu kitchen demolition, dishes still in the cabinets and everything. The guy was devastated they'd lost another baby. Anyway, he says he's ripping out a corner and he always knew there was a dead pocket there because the span was like 3 feet, but the closet behind it was only 2 feet deep. He rips out the drywall and finds a ball of cloth. As he pulls back the layers, he realizes it's the skeleton of a baby. It was wrapped up with a teddy bear. He called the police and said they'd never got any follow-ups on it. The next was from another realtor I knew. They get to a closing and the seller's late. An hour goes by and he's still a no-show. The agent is calling and getting no answer. She knew the seller's nephew who let her in once or something, so she calls him. He drives over to check on his uncle. He opens the door and there's the uncle, dead on the floor. He's wearing his coat and has one shoe on. He died putting his shoes on so he could go to the closing. And yes, the buyer still bought the house, but it took a few extra weeks to close. Another one from my own experience was a house I was asked to sell. It was a fixer-upper, but it was on a nice plot of land. The sellers had some weird relationship going on. She was in her 20s and he was in his 50s. They were married, but she called him daddy and she dressed like a slut. They were not well off by any means, so it's not like she was with him for the money. Anyway, I decided to Google their names to see what came up. They'd been busted for running a puppy mill in the garage and all the dogs were discovered frozen solid in the dead of winter and severely malnourished. After that, I just ignored them. I couldn't even talk to them to tell them I wasn't going to list their house. I'm not a realtor, but suppose the story's relevant. My extended family used to live in a really old house located just north of London. Previously, it used to be Queen Victoria's stop when she was traveling in the area. I'm told my uncle, Mom's sister's husband, when younger never believed in ghosts or spirits and be the first to call it a load of rubbish. He was sleeping one night and was awoken by a man staring at him at the end of his bed, dressed in an old army uniform. My uncle froze for a few seconds, panicked and flicked the bedside lamp on and the man vanished. He refused to sleep in that room from that night onwards. We later found out the man was a previous owner who'd returned from war to find his wife having an affair. He was so furious his wife reported to have told her he'd do the worst thing possible to get back at her. He took his twin sons, toddlers at the time, went to the back of the garden where there was a forest and shot them both dead before killing himself. The funny thing is that since my family brought the property, my uncle had twin sons. My mom had twin sons, and my uncle's brother, who's also a part owner of the property, had twin sons. The weirder part is that my brothers and my uncle's auntie's kids were playing near the forest when they were in their early teens and kept on saying they heard boys laughing but couldn't see anybody there, not knowing the house's history. Edit top line. I work in property management on the rental side. I would frequently do post-move-out walks to assess damage from previous renters and make ready lists for new ones. There was a house on my list that had been vacant for a while in a semi-seedy area. Not a huge deal by any means, as it's the middle of the day. I go to the front door, and it was stuck shut. Shoulder checked it a few times, and it would give a little, but I couldn't get it open. Like furniture or something was barring the way. So I walk around back and completely ignore the broken storm door, leading up to the other entry. The second I opened the door, I noticed 3 guys standing in the living room around a table. One conveniently had a gun pointed directly at me. I apologized and politely let myself out. No more than 10 seconds after getting in my car, our maintenance calls warning me that the property had been broken into half a dozen times already and I shouldn't go in alone. Wasn't the worst I've seen, but certainly the scariest. My dad moved into a house where we later learned the previous owner's son killed himself. There was no saying as to whether he lived in the house, but we do know which bedroom was his. I'm not into paranormal nonsense, but my sister had that room. Before we learned about the son killing himself, she had all sorts of weird things happening in the room. Alarms going off at odd hours of the night. The TV just turns on off whenever it feels like it, especially weird when it's at night and you're alone. I don't like going up there for that reason. The previous owner also came home one day to catch his wife cheating on him and started shooting at them. He missed them, and you can still see the bullet marks in the wall of the master bedroom. Didn't sell the house, but was managing an apartment and walked in on a guy who was in bed decomposing for 2 weeks over the worst heat wave in years. His head was partially melted into the pillow and his back was full of maggots. Had a couple stiff ones that night. Walked through our house where a hoarder lived and was attacked by fleas and saw a rat in the master bedroom the size of a football. Nose droppings on the bed, too. Lady had been living there her entire life and never threw anything away. Apparently, couldn't get rid of the rat either. I flipped and helped with flips and sales since I was 18. I can go on and on with the conditions I've seen people living in and the history behind them. Years ago, I worked for an office that listed houses for sale. One of them in an ad I had to create made my hair stand on end. I noticed it immediately as a weird old flagstone 1910 home with faces carved into the chimney blocks. When I was a kid, this was the murder house, although it was about 3 miles away from my neighborhood. Everyone knew it and talked about it. The story went that in the 1950s, new owner and his family moved in, but the husband murdered his 2 kids and wife. Apparently, the police did not suspect foul play, and the husband said his family had left him. Years later, in the early 80s, the property had gone to pot and the man was raising dogs in his backyard. He died in his own house, and when animal control police arrived, not only was the guy gnawed on by some of his dogs, but his own nephew later found the man's children and wife in a basement freezer, encased in decades of frost. I imagine my surprise when 9-year-old me rode by the place on the day the cops were removing the freezer. I remember seeing it on a blue tarp in the front yard and people taking pictures. That night there was a quick blurb about it on the news. Years later in my 20s while creating the sales, and I learned this was the first time that it was listed for sale since the discovery. The day after my condo received an excellent offer, my realtor forwarded me a newspaper article. In 1991, 2 drifters tried to hack a man to death in my kitchen in front of one of the drifter's 14-year-old daughter. Then strangled him, dragged him down the stairs, and about a block down the street before deciding to abandon their plan to dump him in the Mississippi. This was New Orleans. They were caught because they did a terrible cleanup job. Just turned over couch cushions and didn't bother mopping up all the blood. Real winners. A weird thing about the place was that if I left anything stacked over a certain kitchen counter, it would fall off in the middle of the night, waking me up. I figured it was some shoddy counter work and just stopped leaving stuff in that spot. The condo still sold at a premium and on time even after this was disclosed to buyer. That area was a hot market. One of the people is still in jail. He's a preacher now because, yeah.